There was once a woman who lost so much in a single season that when people asked her name, she could not remember it. She carried her grief from door to door, asking for something, medicine, an answer, a word that might undo what had already been done. No one could help her, and yet, by the end of her journey, she found something she had not been looking for. Not a cure. Something much quieter than that. Tonight we will sit with stories like hers, stories drawn from the ancient wisdom of the Buddha and from gentle traditions across the world, stories that have comforted grieving hearts for over 2,500 years. These are not lessons. They are simply stories, told quietly, the way one might speak to someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time. There is nothing you need to understand tonight. Nothing you need to remember. Nothing you need to do. If sleep comes for you before the stories are finished, that is a beautiful thing. The stories will still be here, and so will you. Let us begin with a woman who lived alone at the edge of a wide, quiet field, in a small house where the loom still stood by the window. She had been a weaver all her life. Her hands knew the rhythm of thread before her mind was fully awake each morning. The pull, the press, the steady back and forth of the shuttle moving through the warp. It was the kind of work that lived in the body, in the shoulders and the wrists and the small muscles between the fingers, and she had done it for so long that her hands carried the memory of every cloth she had ever made. She could tell the quality of wool by rolling it once between her thumb and forefinger, and she could feel when the tension in the warp was off before she could see it. The way a musician hears a note gone slightly flat before anyone else in the room. The house was not large. 2 rooms and a kitchen, with a stove that burned pine logs in the colder months. The smell of pine smoke had settled into the walls over the years, into the curtains and the cushions, and the wool of the blankets folded on the chair by the door. In the evenings, that smell mixed with something else. The faint sweetness of dried lavender that hung in small bundles from the kitchen beam. Bundles she had tied and hung so long ago that she no longer noticed them. The way one stops noticing the color of one's own front door. 8. In the mornings, when the light was still gray and the field outside was hidden beneath a low fog, she would rise and walk to the loom and sit down on the small wooden bench, and the day would begin the way days had always begun, with her hands reaching for the thread. The bench was smooth where she sat, worn pale by years of the same body in the same place, and the floor beneath her feet was cool in the early hours, the kind of cool that seeped upward through thin socks and settled into the ankles. But something had changed. Not in the loom, not in the thread, not in the light that came through the window or the pine smoke that rose from the stove, or the cool of the floor beneath her feet. The other side of the bed was empty. It had been empty for 4 months now, and each morning, before her mind was fully awake, her body would turn toward that side, reaching the way a hand reaches for a door handle. It has turned 10,000 times. And each morning, the reaching found nothing, just the cool, flat sheet, just the pillow that no longer held the shape of anyone's head. She did not cry about this. She had cried in the beginning, the first weeks, the long nights, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere beneath the ribs and does not stop when you want it to. But that had passed. What remained was something quieter, and, in its own way, heavier. A weight she could not put down because she could not find where she was carrying it. It was in her chest when she breathed. It was in her hands when she reached for the shuttle. It was in the silence between the sounds of the loom, in the pause between one row of thread and the next. Her neighbor came by on a Tuesday morning, a kind woman, a little younger, who brought bread sometimes and asked gentle questions. "How are you managing?" the neighbor asked, standing in the doorway with a cloth-wrapped loaf in her hands. "I am fine," the weaver said. "The loom keeps me busy, and the nights are long, but they end." The neighbor set the bread on the table and looked at the half-finished cloth on the loom. "It is beautiful work," she said. "It is the same work I have always done. Is there anything I can bring you? Anything you need?" The weaver paused. She looked at her hands, rough and familiar, resting in her lap. The question was kind, and she knew the neighbor meant it. And she also knew that the honest answer was something she could not say, standing in a doorway on a Tuesday morning. The thing she needed was not something anyone could carry through a doorway. It was not bread or company, or even kindness, though she was grateful for all of it. What she needed was the sound of someone breathing beside her in the dark, the weight of another person turning over in the bed at 3 in the morning, the small creak of the floorboard when he got up to check the stove, the way he used to stand behind her sometimes when she was weaving and rest one hand on her shoulder, not to say anything, not to interrupt, just to let her know he was there. That was what she needed. And it was the one thing no one could bring. "No," she said. "Thank you. I have what I need." The neighbor nodded the way people nod when they know the answer is not the whole truth, but understand that it is all you are able to give right now. She touched the weaver's arm once, gently, and then she left, and the sound of her footsteps on the path grew softer and softer, until the only sound remaining was the quiet ticking of the clock on the kitchen shelf and the low hum of wind moving across the field outside. The weaver sat at the loom for a long time without weaving, and the weaver sat at the loom for a long time without weaving. Her hands rested on the frame, not moving, and she noticed that her chest felt tight, the way it always felt now, as though something was pressing inward from all sides. And without deciding to, without anyone telling her, she placed one hand flat against her own chest, just her palm resting over her heart, not pressing, not trying to fix anything, just resting there. And she felt it, her own heartbeat, steady and quiet beneath her hand, still here, still going, not because she had asked it to, not because she had earned it, simply because that is what hearts do. She sat like that for a while. She did not count the minutes. She did not try to make the feeling mean anything. She simply sat with her hand on her chest, the way one might sit beside a sleeping child, not wanting to wake anything, not wanting to fix anything, just being near. And then, without hurry, she picked up the shuttle and began again. The thread moved through the warp. The loom clicked softly, that familiar wooden sound that had been the rhythm of her days for longer than she could remember. Her hands found the pattern. Her breath settled into the pace of the work, not calm, exactly, but steady. The steadiness that comes not from peace, but from practice, from doing the one thing your body still knows how to do when the rest of you has forgotten. Outside the window, the field was waking up. The fog was thinning. A single bird, she did not see what kind, crossed the grey sky in a long, unhurried line, and the light through the glass shifted, very slowly, from grey to the faintest gold, the way it does on autumn mornings, when the sun is low, and the air is still, and the world seems to be holding its breath, before deciding what kind of day it will be. There is an old teaching, one of the oldest the Buddha ever offered, about the tears we carry. He said that if you were to gather all the tears you have ever shed across all the years and all the losses and all the quiet moments when no one was watching, those tears would fill more than the 4 great oceans, more than all the water in the world. He did not say this to frighten anyone. He said it to remind us of something we already know, that grief is not a sign of weakness. It is the cost of having loved, and the cost is not a punishment. It is a price we pay willingly, even if we did not know we were paying it at the time. The ancient word for this feeling is soka. It does not translate simply as sadness, the way one might be sad about a rainy afternoon or a missed appointment. Soka is deeper than that. It is the kind of sorrow that settles into the bones, the kind that you feel in your chest before your mind has formed a single thought about why. It is the body's way of saying, something that was part of me is no longer here. And if you are lying here tonight, carrying that feeling, if your body knows something your words have not yet caught up with, then you are not alone in it. You have never been alone in it. Every person who has ever loved has stood exactly where you are standing. There was a great oak tree that stood in a clearing for over 200 years. Its trunk was so wide that 2 people could not join their arms around it, and its bark was deeply grooved, dark and rough, the kind of bark that held moisture after rain and released it slowly through the afternoon, so that even on dry days, the air beneath the tree smelled of damp earth and old wood. Its branches reached so wide that in summer, the shade beneath it could shelter an entire family. Children had climbed its lower limbs. Birds nested in the crook, where 2 great branches met. Deer rested beneath it in the heat of the afternoon, their ears turning lazily at the sound of acorns dropping into the grass. Its roots went so deep into the earth that even in drought, its leaves stayed green. When the grasses around it had turned to gold, the roots traveled underground in ways no one could see. Beneath the clearing, beneath the path, beneath the stone wall, at the edge of the meadow, holding the tree steady, the way memory holds a person steady, invisibly, from below. One night, a storm came, the kind of storm that moves slowly, with a weight behind it. The wind did not howl, it pressed. It leaned against the tree the way grief leans against the body, not sharp, not sudden, but with a heaviness that does not let up. And in the pressing, one of the great lower branches, a branch nearly as thick as a man's waist, a branch that had held weight and weather and birds for longer than anyone could remember, cracked and fell. The sound it made was not loud. It was the sound of something old giving way, a deep, slow creak, and then a settling, the way a long-held breath finally releases. In the morning, the clearing was changed. The branch lay across the grass, its leaves still green, as though it did not yet know it had fallen. And where the branch had been, there was a wound, pale wood, open to the air, the raw grain of the tree exposed. You could see the rings in the wood, each ring a year, each year a season of growing and a season of rest. The tree did not try to cover the wound. It did not lean to the other side to compensate. It simply stood there, open, and, over the next days and weeks, a slow sap began to gather at the edges, not to heal, not to close, but to hold. The sap was golden in the light, and it moved so slowly that you could not see it moving, only notice that it had moved. The way you notice one morning that the grief you carry has shifted, not gone, not healed, just resting in a slightly different place. That is what sap does. It holds. And there was a woman who walked a long road in the heat of a dry season, carrying nothing but her grief. The road was unpaved, the kind of road that turns to powder in the dry months and clings to everything: feet, ankles, the hem of a dress, the inside of the throat. The dust was red, the color of clay, and it rose in small clouds with each step and settled again behind her, erasing her footprints almost as fast as she made them. She had lost her husband on the road, taken by a fever that came quickly, the way fevers do when the wells run low and the water turns bad. She had lost her 2 children, one to the river, when the banks gave way after the first rains, and one to the sickness that came after, the small body burning with a heat that no cloth soaked in water could cool. And when she reached the village where her mother and father lived, the village she had walked toward for 3 days, the village she had been carrying in her mind like a lantern in the dark, she found the house dark and the neighbors standing outside with lowered eyes, and she understood before anyone spoke that they too were gone. She did not scream. She did not fall. She simply kept walking, past the house, past the village, past the fields, where the dry grass crackled beneath her bare feet. The sun was white and high, and it pressed down on her shoulders with a weight that had nothing to do with heat. The crows called out from the bare trees at the edge of the road, their voices flat and without echo in the still air. And she walked until she did not know where she was walking. And then she walked further. She walked until the road ended at a place where a very old man sat beneath a small, twisted tree, mending a sandal. The tree gave almost no shade, but he sat beneath it as though it were enough. He looked up as she approached, and though she had not spoken, he set down the sandal and said, "Sit." She sat. He did not ask what had happened. He did not offer comfort or explanation or food. He simply looked at her for a long time, the way one looks at the sky before deciding whether it will rain. Then he said, "You have been crying, yes, for a long time, yes, and yet here you are." She did not know what to say to that. It was not a question. It was not advice. It was simply a thing he had noticed. The way one might notice that the wind had shifted or that the light had changed. "Here I am," she said. "You have walked through fire," the old man said quietly, "and you have not stopped burning, but the fire has not destroyed you. You are still here. That is not nothing." She looked at her hands, dust in the creases of her palms, dust on her feet, dust in her hair, and beneath the dust, still skin, still warmth, still a pulse at the wrist that beat and beat and beat, asking nothing, expecting nothing, simply continuing. "What do I do now?" she whispered. The old man picked up his sandal and resumed mending it. His fingers were steady, patient, threading the leather through the same hole he had threaded 100 times before. "You do not need to do anything," he said. "The arrow is already in you. You did not put it there, but you are the only one who can pull it out." She waited, because it sounded as though there was more. And pulling it out, he said, not looking up, does not mean forgetting. It means choosing to carry the wound honestly, instead of pretending it is not there. A crow passed overhead. Its shadow crossed the ground between them, and was gone. She did not find what she was looking for. She had been looking for a door that would open, a family that would take her in, a place where the missing pieces of her life would be handed back to her, whole and unbroken. She did not find any of that. She found something smaller and much more honest. She was still here. Her lungs still drew breath. Her hands still opened and closed. The blood still moved through her, warm and quiet and faithful, asking nothing in return. And being here, breathing, sitting in the red dust beside an old man who did not try to fix her, feeling the heat on her face and the ache in her feet and the quiet, steady beat of her own heart, was not a consolation prize. It was not second best. It was the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. Something that started not with understanding, but with simply staying, simply being present in the body that had carried her through everything, and letting that be enough. The Buddha once offered a gentle observation about the nature of endearment. He said that from endearment springs grief, from endearment springs fear, and for one who is wholly free from endearment, there is no grief, and so no fear. But he did not say this as advice. He did not say, stop loving, and you will stop hurting. He said it as a description, the way a gardener might say, from rain comes mud, not to stop the rain, just to name the way things are. And tonight, lying here, perhaps you know this already. Perhaps you have known it for longer than you can say. That the grief you carry is not separate from the love you gave. That the weight in your chest is not a mistake. It is the shape that love takes when the person it was meant for is no longer here to receive it. The love does not disappear because the person has gone. It simply has nowhere to land, and so it stays in the body, in the chest, in the throat, in the heaviness of the arms, in the way the eyes fill, without warning at the smallest thing. A song on the radio, a jacket on a hook, the smell of coffee made the way someone else used to make it. You do not need to set it down tonight. You do not need to understand it, or fix it, or move through it on any schedule that anyone else has given you. Grief does not follow a calendar. It does not ask permission. It arrives when it arrives, and it stays as long as it stays. And the only thing you need to do tonight is what you are already doing. Lying here, breathing, allowing the stories to wash over you the way rain washes over a garden. Not asking the garden to do anything, just letting the water find its own way down. You can simply let it be what it is, heavy and honest and yours. And perhaps, as you hear this, something in your chest has softened, just slightly. Not because the sadness is gone, but because you have stopped asking it to leave, because you have allowed it to sit beside you, the way the weaver allowed the empty side of the bed to remain empty without filling it with anything at all. That is enough. That is more than enough. Let us rest here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the weight of your body against whatever is holding you right now. The bed, the pillow, the quiet dark. There is nowhere else you need to be. When you are ready, we will continue together. Because grief, as we will discover, is not only about what we have lost. Sometimes it is about the people who are still here and the silence that has grown between us. Sometimes grief is not about the person who has gone. Sometimes it is about the people who are still here, standing beside you, reaching for your hand, trying to find the right words, and the strange, heavy silence that has settled between you and them, like fog that will not lift. Let us explore this quietly. There was a woman who had spent most of her life taking care of others. She had been a nurse for 30 years, and she was good at it. The kind of good that lives in the hands, in the steadiness of them, in the way they could find a vein in the dark, or smooth a sheet without waking the person beneath it. She had retired 2 years ago, and she had thought that the caring was over, that her hands could finally rest. But now her mother was dying. Not quickly. Not the way a candle goes out when you blow on it. Slowly, the way a candle burns down to the last inch of wax. The flame growing smaller and smaller, but still burning, still giving off heat, still casting a light that moved across the walls of the small bedroom where the old woman lay. The bedroom had been the dining room once. They had moved the bed downstairs when the stairs became too much. And now, the room smelled of lavender oil and the faint, sharp scent of the medications that sat in a row on the nightstand. Small bottles with white labels and careful instructions that the daughter followed every 4 hours, day and night. The lamp on the bedside table was turned to its lowest setting, a warm yellow glow that softened everything it touched. The edge of the pillow, the fold of the blanket, the thin blue veins on the back of her mother's hand. A heart monitor beeped quietly in the corner, steady and patient, counting the seconds the way a metronome counts time in a room where no one is playing music. The daughter sat in the chair beside the bed. She had been sitting there for 6 hours. Her back ached in the place between the shoulder blades, the place where tension gathers when you have been holding yourself upright for too long, without leaning against anything. Her coffee had gone cold on the table beside her. She did not drink it. She had stopped tasting coffee weeks ago. It was just something warm to hold. And now it was not even that. Her phone buzzed on the cushion beside her. A message from a friend. She read it without picking up the phone. She could see the words on the screen from where she sat. "How is your mum doing? Thinking of you both." She typed back with one thumb. "She is resting. Thank you for asking." The friend replied quickly. "Let me know if you need anything." "I will. Thank you." She set the phone down. She did not feel grateful. She did not feel ungrateful. She felt the way a stone feels at the bottom of a river. Heavy, smooth, unable to move in any direction. The water passing over and around and through, and the stone just sitting there, being a stone. What she wanted, what she could not say to anyone, because saying it would sound like complaining, and she was not complaining. She was just tired in a way that sleep could not fix, was for someone to ask about her. Not about her mother, not about the medications or the schedule, or whether the hospice nurse was coming on Tuesday or Thursday. Just about her, about the woman sitting in the chair, about how she was holding up, and whether she had eaten today, and whether she had cried yet, and whether the weight in her chest was getting heavier or lighter, or staying exactly the same. But people did not ask that. People asked about her mother, because her mother was the one who was dying. And that was the right question, the appropriate question, the question that showed care, and concern. And she understood that. She did not blame anyone for it. She only noticed that there was a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being the one who is not dying, the one who is left standing beside the bed, holding the hand, doing the work of watching, and being watched by no one. The hours passed the way. Hours pass in a sick room. Not fast, not slow but thick, each minute dense with listening, with waiting, with the small adjustments of a pillow or a blanket, or the angle of a straw in a glass of water. The house was quiet in the way that only houses with someone dying in them are quiet, not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of held breath, of everyone and everything leaning in, paying attention to the one small flame still burning in the room. And then, sometime after midnight, when the daughter had begun to drift into that half-sleep that comes from sitting too long in a warm room, her mother opened her eyes, not all the way, just enough, the way a window opens a crack on a still afternoon, not to let anything in, just to allow the air to move. "Is it raining?" her mother asked. The daughter sat up. She looked at the dark window. "No, Mama, it is clear tonight. I thought I heard rain, maybe the wind. There is a little wind tonight." Her mother's hand moved on the blanket, a small movement, the fingers opening and closing, the way a child reaches for something in a dream. The daughter took her mother's hand. It was cool and light, the bones close beneath the skin, and she held it the way you hold something that you know you cannot keep. Gently, with all the attention you have, without squeezing. "You are still here," her mother said. Not a question. "I am still here." "Good," her mother said. And then she closed her eyes, and her breathing settled back into its slow rhythm, and the room returned to its quiet, and the daughter sat there, holding her mother's hand in the yellow light, and she thought, "This is enough. This moment, this small, ordinary, unremarkable moment, her mother's hand in hers, the sound of breathing, the glow of the lamp, it would not last." She knew that with the kind of certainty that lives in the body, not the mind. But it was here now, and she was here to hold it. The two of them sat like that, one sleeping, one watching, and the night continued around them the way nights do, quietly, without asking anyone's permission. The Buddha once offered a gentle observation about the nature of holding on. He said that one should hold nothing dear, for separation from the dear is painful. And for those to whom nothing is dear, there are no bonds, and so no pain. This sounds, at first, like a cold thing to say. Hold nothing dear. Let nothing matter. But that is not what he meant. He was not prescribing. He was describing the way a doctor describes the course of an illness, not to frighten the patient, but to prepare them. He was saying, if you love, you will grieve. That is the shape of things. And knowing that shape does not make the grief smaller, but it may make it less surprising. And there is a kind of comfort in not being surprised by your own pain. The ancient word for this holding on is apadana. It does not simply mean attachment. It means fuel, the kind of fuel that keeps a fire burning. And sometimes the fire of grief burns so long and so steadily, not because the loss is fresh, but because we keep adding fuel without knowing it. We add the fuel of how things should have been, the fuel of what we wish we had said, the fuel of imagining a version of the story where no one leaves and nothing changes, and the people we love are always sitting across the table from us, always within reach. And letting go of upadana does not mean letting go of the person. It means letting go of the insistence that things should be different from the way they are. It means allowing the fire to burn down to embers and sitting with the embers and finding that the warmth they give off is gentler than the blaze and just as real. There was a man who made pottery in a small workshop beside a river. The workshop had been there for as long as anyone in the village could remember. A low building with a sloping roof and walls darkened by years of kiln smoke. The river ran beneath the wooden floor, and on quiet mornings, when the wheel was still and the kiln had not yet been lit, you could hear the water moving underneath, steady and unhurried, the way it had moved for centuries before anyone built a workshop above it. The air inside always smelled of wet clay. That particular smell, cool and mineral, like the inside of the earth turned outward, and beneath the clay, the sharper smell of the glaze compounds stored in jars along the far wall, and the faint, woody scent of the ash that he mixed into his glazes. Ash collected from the orchard across the lane, where apple trees grew in uneven rows and dropped their fruit every autumn into the long grass. His hands were wide and rough, the skin cracked along the knuckles, the nails permanently stained with traces of iron oxide and cobalt. He had been a potter for 40 years, and his hands knew the work the way the weaver's hands knew thread. By feel, by memory, by the kind of understanding that lives deeper than language. He could center a lump of clay on the wheel with his eyes closed. He could tell by the sound the wheel made whether the clay was too wet or too dry. And for most of those 40 years, he had worked beside his closest friend, another potter, an older man, who had taught him the trade when he was young, who had stood beside him at the wheel and guided his hands and said, again and again, with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world, slower, let the clay tell you what it wants to be. But the friend was gone now, 3 months gone. A quiet death, the kind that comes in sleep, the kind that people call peaceful, though the man was not sure that any death felt peaceful to the people left behind. And now the workshop felt wrong. Not empty. It was full of pots and tools and shelves lined with finished work. But wrong the way a song sounds wrong when one voice drops out. The rhythm was still there. The melody was still there. But something beneath it had shifted. And every note that followed sounded slightly off, slightly hollow, slightly less than what it had been. He tried to work. He sat at the wheel and pressed his foot against the pedal and felt the familiar vibration travel up through his leg and into his hips and spine. And his hands reached for the clay, and he began to shape. But each bowl he made reminded him of something. The curve of this one was like a bowl his friend had admired. The color of that glaze was one they had developed together, mixing and remixing over a long weekend, arguing gently about the ratio of ash to feldspar. Every piece he touched carried a conversation he could no longer have, and after a few weeks, he stopped working altogether. The wheel sat still. The clay dried in its bin. The kiln went cold. He thought about breaking things. He looked at the shelves of finished bowls, his friends' bowls, bowls they had made side by side. The glazes running into each other in the kiln the way their laughter used to run into each other across the workshop. And he thought, I could sweep them all onto the floor. I could hear them shatter. akute. I could feel something break that matches what is already broken inside me. And maybe that would help. He did not break them. Instead, he sat in the quiet workshop and looked at the river through the open door, and the sap moved in him the way it had moved in the oak tree. Slowly, without hurry, gathering at the edges of the wound. And then, one morning, a morning when the mist was so thick on the river that the far bank had disappeared entirely, so that the water seemed to flow into nothing, into whiteness, into a place where the world simply stopped. He noticed something on the workbench beside the wheel, a cup of tea, still warm, steam rising from it in a thin, quiet line. He looked at it for a long time. He could not remember making it. He had not been in the kitchen. And then he understood. His wife had placed it there. She had been placing it there every morning for 3 months, walking in before he arrived, setting the tea on the bench, leaving without a word, every single morning. And he had not seen it, not once. He had been so deep in the loss of his friend that he had not noticed the woman who was still here, still beside him, still caring for him in the only language she had, the language of small, quiet acts that ask for nothing in return. He picked up the tea. He held it in both hands. It was warm, and the warmth traveled through the clay of the cup and into his palms and up through his wrists. And for the first time in 3 months, his hands felt like they belonged to him again. He did not know it then, but his wife had been grieving too. She had loved the old potter. He had been at their wedding. He had made the bowls they ate from every evening. His death had left a gap in her life as well. Not the same shape as her husband's gap, but a gap nonetheless. And she had filled it not by closing herself off, not by asking to be seen, but by doing the one small thing she could do each morning: boiling water, steeping leaves, setting a cup in the place where a pair of tired hands would find it. That is sometimes how love speaks when words have failed. It speaks in tea, in bread left on a table, in a blanket pulled up over sleeping shoulders, in the quiet, stubborn act of showing up, again and again, without being asked. There were 2 neighbors who lived side by side on a narrow street, in houses so close that you could hear a kettle whistling through the shared wall. They were not friends. Exactly. They were the kind of neighbors who nod and wave and bring in each other's packages when it rains. The kind of closeness that is built not on conversation, but on proximity and the slow accumulation of small kindnesses. In the same week, both of them lost someone they loved. One lost a sister, the other lost a husband. The grief came to both houses at the same time, the way a storm comes to an entire valley at once. No house spared, no roof untouched. One of them closed her door. She drew the curtains. She turned off the porch light. She did not answer knocks. She sat in the dark of her living room and held her grief the way one holds a stone, tightly, close to the body, unwilling to let it go, because letting it go would mean admitting it was real. The other opened her door. Not wide, just a crack, just enough to let the air move through. She did not invite anyone in. She did not go out. She simply left the door open, the way one leaves a window open on a warm night. Not because you want the world to come in, but because you need to know that the world is still there. And something happened. The air moved. The sounds of the street drifted in. Children, bicycles, a dog barking 3 houses down. The ordinary, unremarkable sounds of life continuing. And she sat in her chair, near the open door, and she cried. And the wind touched her face while she cried. And somehow, she could not explain it, and she did not try. The crying was easier with the wind on her face than it would have been in the dark behind a closed door. She was not less sad. She was not braver. She had simply made a different choice. Not a grand choice, not a wise choice, just a small one. She had let the air in, and the air had done what air does. It had moved through her. Tonight, if there is someone you have not called back, a friend whose message you left unanswered, a sister whose voice you have been avoiding because hearing it would make the grief too real, a neighbor who knocked and found your door closed. You are not wrong for that. Closing the door is not weakness. It is what the body does when it has taken in more than it can hold. It closes. It protects. It draws the curtains and sits in the dark and waits for the shaking to stop. But when you are ready, not tonight, not tomorrow, not on anyone's schedule but your own, perhaps you will open the door, just a crack, not to invite anyone in, not to be strong, just to feel the air move across your face, just to remember that the world is still there, and that somewhere in it, someone is still setting a cup of tea in the place where your hands will find it. Perhaps, without you noticing, someone has already done this. Perhaps there is a kindness you have not yet seen, a message you have not read, a meal someone left at your door, a hand that reached for yours in the dark. You do not need to see it tonight, but it may be there. And when your eyes adjust to the new shape of things, you may find it waiting. The night has grown deeper now. The air outside, wherever you are, has cooled just a little. And there is one more thread to follow tonight, a thread that is quieter and more difficult than the ones we have been following so far. It is about the things we say to ourselves in the dark. After everyone else has gone to sleep, the conversations we replay, the words we wish we had spoken, the moments we wish we could reach back through time and hold just a little longer. There is something even more difficult than losing someone, and that is learning to forgive yourself for the things you did not say, the moments you did not hold, the love you meant to give but ran out of time to give it. Let us explore that gently. When something breaks, the first thing we reach for is a way to fix it. Glue for the broken cup, tape for the torn page, words, careful, chosen words, for the person sitting across from us whose face has changed in a way we do not recognize. We reach for repair the way we reach for a light switch in a dark room. Automatically, without thinking, because that is what we have always done when something is not the way it should be. But there are things that break and cannot be mended. Not because they are too damaged, but because the breaking has changed their shape, and the old shape, the one we keep trying to restore, is not coming back. And the most difficult moment in grief is not the breaking itself. It is the moment we stop reaching for the glue. A young student once traveled a long distance to visit an old teacher who lived in a monastery at the foot of a mountain. The student had lost someone. The details do not matter as much as the weight of it, the way it sat behind his eyes and made the world look flat and colorless, as though the light had been turned down in every room he entered. He found the teacher sitting in the courtyard, mending a sandal. The teacher did not look up when the student approached. He continued stitching, the needle moving through the leather with a slow, practiced rhythm. "Teacher," the student said, "I have come because my heart is broken. and I do not know how to mend it." The teacher did not stop stitching. He did not look up. He simply said, "Show me." "Show you what?" "Show me the broken part." The student placed his hand over his chest. "It is here." The teacher looked at the student's hand on his chest for a long time. Then he said, "That is where the heart is, yes. But who told you it was broken?" The student opened his mouth and then closed it. He had no answer that did not sound like a story he had been telling himself. A story about what a heart should feel like, about what wholeness should look like, about the difference between a heart that is working and a heart that has stopped being what it was. The teacher returned to his sandal. "A heart that has been touched by loss," he said, threading the needle through once more, "is not a broken heart. It is a heart that has been opened. And an open thing is not the same as a broken thing." He tied off the thread, held up the sandal, and examined it. Then he set it down and looked at the student for the first time. "You did not come here to mend anything," he said. "You came here because you thought something was wrong with you. There is nothing wrong with you. You are grieving. That is what hearts do. Let us sit with that for a moment." And then follows a story that has been told for over 2,500 years. A story about a woman who went looking for a cure and found something very different instead. She was young. That is the first thing to know about her. Young enough that the loss she carried seemed impossible. The kind of thing that happens to other people, in other villages, in stories told around evening fires. Not to her, not to the child she held in her arms. Wrapped in a cloth that still smelled of milk and sleep, and the particular warmth that belongs to very small children who have not yet learned to be afraid of anything. The village where she lived sat on the shoulder of a hill, the kind of hill that catches the last light of the afternoon and holds it longer than the valley below. The houses were small, built from clay and timber, with roofs of dried palm leaf that rustled when the wind came up from the south. Smoke rose from the cooking fires in thin threads that tangled together above the rooftops and drifted toward the tree line. And in the evenings, the whole hillside smelled of wood smoke and rice and the jasmine that grew along the path to the well. The child had died, not violently, not dramatically, but in the way that small children sometimes died in those times. A fever that came on a clear afternoon and burned through the night, the small body growing hotter and hotter, despite the damp cloths she pressed against his forehead, despite the prayers she whispered into the dark, despite the fierce and desperate love that poured from her hands into his skin. By morning, the fever had taken everything, and the mother, who was not much more than a girl herself, could not understand how this was possible, how the world could look the same hills, the same path, the same doves calling from the rooftops. When everything in it had changed, she would not let go of the child. She carried him from house to house, asking for medicine. Her neighbors looked at her with soft, frightened eyes and shook their heads. And she walked on, because surely, somewhere there was a door that would open, a hand that would reach out, a voice that would say the words that would undo what had been done. The path wound uphill through grass that was dry and golden in the late summer heat. Crickets sang in the ditches. The smell of cut hay drifted from the fields below, sweet and warm and utterly ordinary. And she walked through all of it, the way one walks through a dream, present, but not quite touching anything, her feet moving, because her feet knew how to move, her arms holding the child, because her arms knew how to hold. At the top of the hill, she came to a small house where an old woman sat on the step, shelling beans into a clay bowl. The old woman looked up and saw the young mother standing there, and she did not flinch, and she did not look away. "You are looking for medicine," the old woman said. "Yes, I can tell you where to find it." The old woman set the bowl of beans aside. "Bring me a mustard seed, a single mustard seed, from any house in this village. But it must come from a house where no one has ever died. No parent, no child, no husband, no wife. A house that has never known loss." The young mother nodded. A mustard seed. That was small, that was possible. She turned and walked back down the hill, and she began to knock on doors. The first house she came to belonged to a woman her own age, with 2 children playing in the yard. "Yes, I have mustard seeds," the woman said. "But my father died last winter. He sat in that chair by the window, and one morning he did not wake up." The second house was an old man who lived alone. "My wife," he said, and that was all he needed to say. The way he said it, the pause before the word, the way his hand moved to his chest, told the whole story. The third house, the fourth, the fifth. A son lost to the river, a sister taken by the coughing sickness, a grandmother who had lived to 90 and died in her sleep. And even in that house, even in the house of the gentlest death, the loss was real. And the mustard seed could not be given. She knocked on every door in the village, and at every door she heard a story. Not the same story. Each one was different. Each one had its own shape and its own weight and its own particular quality of silence afterward. But in every house, loss had visited. In every house, someone was missing. She did not find the mustard seed. She walked back up the hill in the fading light, the child still in her arms, and she sat down on the step beside the old woman, who had finished shelling the beans and was now just sitting, watching the first stars appear above the tree line. "There is no house," the young mother said quietly. "No," the old woman said, "there is not." The young mother looked down at the child in her arms. The cloth was still warm. The small weight was still familiar. And something shifted in her. Not a breaking, not a healing, but a settling. The way a stone settles to the bottom of a stream after being tossed in. She was still holding the child. She was still aching, but the aching had changed. It had widened, somehow, to include every door she had knocked on, every story she had heard, every pair of eyes that had looked at her with recognition. Instead of pity, she was not alone. That was the one thing she had not known before she started knocking. She had thought grief was a room with one chair. It was not. It was a village, and every house in it had a light on. A woman who had lived many centuries later and suffered a grief so deep it took her voice away, once said, after she had come through the other side of it, "As he has come, so has he gone. What is there here to grieve about?" She did not mean this cruelly. She did not mean, "do not feel." She meant something closer to, "This is the shape of things." People arrive in our lives without invitation and leave without permission. They come from a place we do not understand and return to a place we cannot follow. And in between, they live beside us for what always feels like too few days, no matter how many years it has been. The ancient word for this ache, This sense that something is missing, that the world does not quite fit, that there is a gap between how things are and how they ought to be, is dukkha. It is often translated as suffering, but that is not quite right. Dukkha is closer to the feeling of a wheel that does not turn smoothly, a door that does not close all the way, a song that ends one note too soon. It is the almost, the not quite, the feeling of reaching for something that was there a moment ago, and finding empty air. And grief is one of the clearest windows into dukkha, because in grief, the gap is not abstract. It is specific. It has a name. It has a face. It has a side of the bed. And nothing, no teaching, no wisdom, no amount of time can fill it, because it was never meant to be filled. It was meant to be carried. And the carrying is the work. There was a man who made things from wood. He had done this for 30 years, in a workshop at the end of a village lane that was lined on both sides with chestnut trees, whose leaves turned copper in the autumn and fell in slow, spiraling arcs that collected against the workshop door like quiet visitors waiting to be let in. The workshop itself was a single room with a high ceiling and a row of windows along the south wall that let in a clean, even light, the kind of light that woodworkers need, a light that shows the grain honestly, without shadow, without flattery. The floor was thick, with sawdust, pale gold on the surface, and darker underneath where the older layers had settled, and the walls were hung with tools, chisels and planes and handsaws, and measuring squares, each in its place, each worn smooth at the handle, from years of the same grip, the same motion, the same steady patience. The air smelled of linseed oil, and the particular warm scent of oak when it is freshly planed, a scent like bread and rain, and something else that has no name, something that only wood gives off when a blade has passed through it cleanly. And beneath that, the fainter smell of the beeswax he used for finishing, sweet and golden, a smell that clung to his shirts and his hands and followed him home in the evenings. His wife had died 5 years ago. 5 years. Long enough, people said, though he was never sure what they meant by that. Long enough for what? Long enough to stop missing her? He had not stopped. Long enough to stop reaching for the phone to tell her something funny he had seen. He had not stopped that either. 5 years had taught him only that grief does not have a schedule, and that people who say time heals are speaking about a different kind of time than the one he was living in. He worked because working was what he knew. His hands moved over the wood the way the weaver's hands moved over thread, by memory, by habit, by the kind of knowledge that lives in the muscles and the joints, and does not require the mind to be present. He could plane a board while thinking of nothing at all, and some days that was the only aid, was the only mercy available to him, the mercy of a body that knows what to do when the mind has given up telling it. One afternoon, his neighbor came to the workshop door, a younger man, friendly, a little awkward, the kind of neighbor who borrows a ladder and returns it with a bottle of wine balanced on the top rung. "I need a bench," the neighbor said, leaning against the door frame with his hands in his pockets. "For the front porch, something my wife and I can sit on in the evenings. Wide enough that we can both sit without bumping elbows. You know the kind." The carpenter looked at him. "A bench for two," he said. "Yes, for two." There was a pause. Not long, not dramatic, just the space of a single breath held a little longer than usual. The neighbor did not notice it, but the carpenter felt it, the way you feel a shift in the wind before the weather changes. "I can make that," the carpenter said. The neighbor smiled and left, and the carpenter stood alone in his workshop with the order written on a scrap of wood the way he always wrote his orders, in pencil, in a hand that was steady, because hands that work with wood cannot afford to shake. He took the measurements. He selected the wood, 2 wide boards of white oak, straight-grained, the kind of wood that ages well, that turns silver in the weather instead of grey. And he began to work. He shaped the seat first, running the plane along the grain in long, slow strokes, the curls of wood falling to the floor in pale spirals. The sound of the plane was steady and rhythmic, almost musical, and the sawdust rose in the morning light, like something weightless, trying to find a place to land. He shaped the legs, turned them on the lathe, felt the wood smooth itself under his hands until it was ready. And, as he worked, he realized that he was building a bench for 2 people, and that the last bench for 2 he had built had been for himself and his wife 20 years ago, a bench that still sat on his own porch, weathered now, the wood silvered, the seat worn smooth in 2 places, one on the left, one on the right. He finished the bench. He sanded it until the surface was so smooth that running a hand across it was like touching water. He oiled it with linseed until the grain glowed. And then, instead of delivering it to his neighbor right away, he carried it out to his own porch and set it beside the old bench. Just for a moment, he told himself, just to see. He sat down on the old bench, the left side, his side. The right side was empty, the way it had been empty for 5 years, and he did not try to fill it. He did not place a cushion there, or a book, or a coat. He let it be empty, and the emptiness held something. He could not explain what. It was not her. It was not a ghost or a memory or a feeling. It was more like the shape she had left behind. The way a river leaves its shape in the bank long after the water has found a different path. She was in the curve of the armrest where her elbow had rested. She was in the slight dip of the seat where her weight had pressed the wood. Year after year, evening after evening. She was in the emptiness itself, and the emptiness was not nothing. It was the opposite of nothing. It was the space where love had been, and space, he understood now, is not the same as absence. The Buddha once said that however we imagine things will turn out, they always turn out differently. Such is the way of the world. And perhaps that is the gentlest thing that can be said about grief, that it will not be what you expect. It will not follow the path you have planned for it. It will not leave when you ask it to leave. And it will not stay in the shape you have given it. It will surprise you, not with its cruelty, but with its patience and its stubbornness and its strange, quiet willingness to sit beside you on the porch and watch the light change. Tonight, if there is something in your life that feels broken, a relationship, a memory, a version of yourself that you keep trying to rebuild, perhaps you can let it rest just for now. Not forever, not as a decision, just for tonight. Perhaps your hands have unclenched without you deciding to unclench them. Perhaps the jaw has softened slightly, the way a fist softens when it has been closed for so long that the fingers have forgotten why they were gripping in the first place. You do not need to fix anything tonight. The broken thing is not going anywhere. It will be there in the morning, and you can pick it up then if you choose. But right now, in this moment, you can set it down. Not because it does not matter, but because your hands are tired, and tired hands deserve to rest. Let us rest here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the gentle weight of your body settling into the bed, into the quiet, into the stillness that has been waiting for you all evening. When you are ready, we will continue together, and we will turn to something very quiet, the things they left behind. A coat on a hook, a cup in the cupboard, a book with a folded page. These small things carry more than we expect, and they have their own stories to tell. There is a particular kind of grief that lives in objects, not in the large, important things, not in the house itself, or the car, or the documents in the filing cabinet, but in the small things, the things no one else would think to keep. A hairbrush with a few strands still caught in the bristles. A pair of reading glasses left on the arm of a chair. A grocery list written in a handwriting you would recognize anywhere, even in the dark, even after years. Even if someone showed it to you without telling you whose it was. These small things carry weight that has nothing to do with what they are made of. And tonight, let us sit with some of them. There was a woman, 62 years old, retired, the kind of woman who kept lists and organized drawers, and could tell you where every photograph in the house had been taken, who stood in the hallway of her mother's house on a cold afternoon in December, trying to decide what to do next. Her mother had died 11 days ago. The funeral was over. The flowers had been taken to the church. The cards had been read and stacked on the kitchen table, in a pile that grew smaller each day as she moved them, one by one, into a box she had labeled "Cards, Mama," in black marker. She was the kind of woman who labeled things. It gave her a sense of order, and order was the only thing she had right now that felt like solid ground. The house was cold, not because the heating was broken. It was working, the radiator in the hallway ticking softly the way radiators do, that quiet metallic sound like a clock that has lost its rhythm. The house was cold because no one had been living in it for 3 weeks, and houses know when they are empty. The air smells different. The light falls differently on surfaces that no one has touched. There is a stillness that is not peaceful, but held, like a breath that has been drawn in and not yet released. She walked through the rooms slowly. The bedroom, where the bed was still made the way her mother had taught her to make beds. Hospital corners. The sheet pulled tight, the pillows propped against the headboard, like two people sitting up and waiting for company. The bathroom, where a thin ring of dried soap sat in the dish beside the sink, and a towel hung on the hook behind the door, still holding the faint shape of the last pair of hands that had folded it. The kitchen, where the spice rack above the stove held jars arranged in alphabetical order, allspice, bay leaves, cardamom, cinnamon, and the oven mitt hung from the same hook it had hung from for as long as she could remember. The fabric worn thin at the thumb, the cotton softened by 1,000 small acts of reaching in and pulling out. She opened the drawer beside the stove. Inside, a collection of objects that made sense only to someone who had lived in this kitchen for 40 years. A ball of string, a pair of scissors with orange handles, a book of matches from a restaurant that had closed in 1987, a pencil stub, and a small notebook, spiral-bound, the cover bent, the pages filled with her mother's handwriting. Recipes, not copied from a book, written from memory, in the shorthand that only the cook understands. A good handful of flour, butter the size of an egg, bake until it smells right. She held the notebook in both hands and felt her throat close the way it had been closing for 11 days. That tightening that comes before tears but does not always lead to them, sometimes just stays there, a knot that neither tightens fully nor releases. Her phone buzzed. Her sister, calling from 3 states away. "How is it going?" her sister asked, slowly. "Have you started sorting?" "I have started looking. The sorting comes after." A pause. Then her sister said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be practical, "We should probably decide what to keep. The furniture, the dishes, you know, before we have to give up the lease." I know. "So what do we keep?" She looked around the kitchen, at the spice rack, the oven mitt, the notebook in her hands, the tea towel draped over the oven door, with a pattern of small blue flowers that her mother had chosen, because they matched the curtains which had been replaced twice since then. But the tea towel had survived, because tea towels do not wear out as fast as curtains, and because her mother could not throw away something that was still useful. "I do not know," she said. "Everything is her. Every drawer I open is another conversation I was not ready to have." Her sister was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Take what fits in your car. Leave the rest. I will come next month, and we will finish together." But here is the thing she did not tell her sister. The thing she did not tell anyone, because it sounded foolish, and she was not a foolish woman. This was not the first time she had stood in this house, with empty boxes and good intentions. She had done this before. 3 times in 30 years, she had come to this house to sort and pack and clear out, and 3 times she had carried everything home. The dishes, the quilts, the boxes of letters, the Christmas ornaments wrapped in tissue paper, the small ceramic bird that sat on the windowsill and served no purpose, except to be there, to be familiar, to be the first thing you saw when you walked into the kitchen on a winter morning. And the light was coming through the window, and the bird was catching it, turning it green, throwing a small patch of colored light onto the wall beside the stove. 3 times she had taken everything home because she could not bear to leave it, and 3 times she had stored it in closets and attics and spare rooms, and the weight of it had grown, not just in her house but in her chest. The feeling that she was keeping her mother alive by keeping her mother's things, and that letting go of the things would be letting go of her. But this time, standing in the kitchen, holding the notebook, listening to the radiator tick, she understood something she had not understood before. Her mother was not in the notebook. She was not in the tea towel, or the spice rack, or the ceramic bird. She was not in any of these objects. She was in the hands that had touched them. And the hands were gone, and keeping the objects would not bring the hands back. She set the notebook down on the counter. She looked at it for a long time. Then she reached into the drawer and pulled out one thing, a small handkerchief, white cotton, edged with a narrow border of lace that was coming loose at one corner. It was not valuable. It was not beautiful. It was not even particularly clean, but it was light. It weighed almost nothing, and she could carry it in her coat pocket without anyone knowing it was there. She put the handkerchief in her pocket and walked to the front door. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back into the hallway. The radiator ticking, the light falling on the empty floor, the house holding its breath the way houses do when they know they are about to be left. Then she stepped outside and closed the door behind her. And the handkerchief in her pocket was warm against her hip, and the cold air touched her face, and she did not cry. She had cried already. What she felt now was something else, something closer to a door closing gently. The kind of closing that is not a slam but a settling, the soft click of a latch finding its place. There is a word in the old language, anusati, that is sometimes translated as remembrance, but that is not quite what it means. Anusati is not the passive kind of remembering that happens when a song comes on the radio, and suddenly you are 23 again, standing in a kitchen that no longer exists. Anusati is active. It is choosing to remember. It is picking up the memory the way you pick up a smooth stone from a riverbed, deliberately, with attention, turning it over in your hands and looking at it clearly. In good light, without flinching, and in grief. Anusati is the difference between being haunted by someone and honoring them. It is the difference between a closet full of objects you cannot touch and a single handkerchief in your pocket that you reach for once a day, gently, to remind yourself that love does not need a house to live in. An old verse, spoken by a woman who had lost everything and found her way through, puts it simply: uninvited, he came from there; unpermitted, he has gone from here. And having come from who knows where, he lived for but a few short days. She did not mean this bitterly. She meant it the way the tide means it when it goes out, not as a punishment, but as a rhythm. People arrive, people leave, and what remains is not the person, but the shape they made in you while they were here. Tonight, if there is a drawer you have not opened, a closet you have not cleaned out, a voicemail you cannot bring yourself to delete, a name you still have not removed from the contacts in your phone, that is all right. There is no deadline for these things. They will wait. And when you are ready, you will know. There is a small creature that carries its home on its back. The snail moves through the world slowly, so slowly that you can watch it and still not see it move. The way you can watch the hour hand of a clock and know that it is turning, but never quite catch the turning itself. It carries its shell everywhere, over the garden wall, through the wet grass, across the stone path in the early morning. When the dew is still heavy and the air smells of earth and rain and the particular green scent of things that are growing. The shell is not decoration. It is the record of a life. Each spiral, each ridge, each thin layer of calcium laid down over months and years is a chapter. The shell grows with the snail, widening as the body widens, curving as the body curves. And by the time the snail has lived its full life, the shell is a perfect autobiography, written in a language that only time can read. When the snail dies, the shell remains. You find them in the garden sometimes, empty, light as paper, the opening facing the sky. The body is gone, but the shape is still there. Every curve, every ridge, every record of growth and rest and growth again. The shell does not decay the way the body does. It holds. It sits in the grass or on the stone wall, and the rain fills it, and the rain drains out, and the sun warms it, and the night cools it, and it goes on holding the shape of a life that is no longer being lived. That is what the things they leave behind do. They hold the shape, not the person, not the life, just the shape, the outline, the impression, the way a hand pressed into wet clay leaves a mark that stays long after the hand has been lifted. There was a woman who kept a lighthouse on a cliff above the sea. The lighthouse was old, older than she was, older than anyone alive who remembered its first lighting. It was built of stone, grey and salt-streaked, and the stairs inside wound upward in a tight spiral that she climbed every evening at dusk. Her hand on the iron railing, her breath steady from years of the same climb. The same number of steps, the same turn at the top where the wind always hit her face, no matter which direction it was coming from. Her husband had been the keeper before her. He had climbed these stairs for 25 years, before his heart stopped one afternoon in the lantern room, quietly, without warning, the way a candle goes out when the wax runs down. She had found him sitting in the chair by the window, his hands in his lap, his face turned toward the sea, and for a moment, just one moment, she had thought he was sleeping. That was 10 years ago, and she had stayed. Not because the lighthouse needed her, though it did. Not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was also true. She had stayed because the lighthouse was the last conversation she and her husband had shared. Every evening, when she climbed the stairs and lit the lamp and watched the beam sweep out across the dark water, she was continuing a sentence he had started. She was saying, with fire and glass and the steady turning of the lens, "I am still here. The light is still on. The work you loved is still being done." The lamp was oil-fed, an old design, the kind that needed tending. You could not simply flip a switch and walk away. You had to trim the wick. You had to fill the reservoir. You had to watch the flame and adjust it, coaxing it higher when the wind pressed against the glass, or easing it back when the air was still and the flame burned too hot. It was the kind of work that required presence, and she had come to understand that this was the point. The lamp needed her attention the way grief needs attention. Not once, not in a single dramatic moment of letting go, but every day, every evening, again and again, the steady tending of something that matters. On this night, a night in the deep of winter, when the wind was coming from the northwest, and the waves were throwing themselves against the base of the cliff with a force she could feel through the stone floor, the flame began to gutter. Not dramatically, just a flicker, a slight dimming, the way a person's eyes dim when they are very tired. She reached for the wick adjuster and turned it, and the flame steadied, and then the wind hit again, and the flame dropped, and for one long moment the lantern room went dark. She cupped her hands around the glass. Her fingers were cold. Her palms were rough from years of rope and metal and the salt air that worked its way into every crack in the skin. And she held her hands there, around the warmth, and she spoke to it, not in words, not out loud, but in the quiet language of someone who has been alone for a long time and has learned to communicate with fire, with wind, with the steady pulse of light sweeping the water. The flame caught. It rose. It found its rhythm again, and the beam went out across the sea, and somewhere out there, she could not see them, but she knew they were there. Boats were turning toward the light, the way lost things turn toward whatever is brightest. She sat down in the chair by the window, his chair, the same chair she had found him in 10 years ago, and she looked at the flame. And she understood something she had been circling around for a decade. She was not keeping the light on for him. She was not keeping it on because he had asked her to, or because she owed it to his memory, or because letting it go out would mean letting him go. She was keeping it on because he had taught her that light matters most when the night is darkest. And that was not his light. It was not her light. It was just light, steady, faithful, unconcerned with who had lit it, caring only that someone had and that it was still burning. Outside, the storm was easing. The waves still crashed, but further away now, as though they had tired of the cliff and were looking for somewhere else to spend their energy. The wind dropped from a howl to a moan to a whisper, and then to something quieter than a whisper, just the sound of air moving through the narrow gap between the lantern glass and the iron frame, a sound like breathing, like someone sleeping in the next room. The old verse came to her, though she had never read it and did not know where it was from. My thorn indeed has been removed, buried in the heart, so hard to see. She did not know the woman who had first spoken those words, many centuries ago, in a country she had never visited, but she knew the feeling. The thorn had been there so long she had forgotten it was a thorn. She had thought it was part of her. And now, sitting in the chair, watching the flame burn steadily against the dark, she realized that the thorn was not the grief itself. The thorn was the belief that she needed the grief in order to keep him close. And she did not. He was already close. He was in the light. Tonight, if there is an object on your nightstand, a photograph you keep meaning to put away but never do, a ring you still wear on the same finger, a book with a bookmark left in the page where someone else stopped reading, you do not need to move it. You do not need to explain it. You do not need to decide whether keeping it is healthy or holding on or moving forward or falling behind. It is simply there, the way the shell is there after the snail has gone, the way the light is there after the keeper has left the room. It holds a shape, and shapes do not ask to be understood. They only ask to be seen, perhaps. As you lie here, your hands have found something to hold. The edge of a blanket, a pillow, the soft fold of a sheet, and perhaps your hands have softened around it, not gripping, not clutching, just resting, holding the way the shell holds the shape of a life, gently, without needing anything from it, just the warmth of contact, just the quiet fact of touching something in the dark, and knowing it is there. That is all. That is what we have been learning tonight, without calling it learning. That grief is not a problem to be solved, that the things they left behind are not burdens to be sorted, that the light does not need to know who lit it in order to keep burning. Let us rest here for a moment. Let the breath settle. Let the body find its weight against the bed. When you are ready, we will continue together. Because grief, we are beginning to discover, changes shape over time. It does not leave, but it learns to move differently, the way a season returns each year, familiar, but never quite the same as the last time it came through. Grief changes shape. That is the thing no one tells you when it first arrives. They say it will get better, or it will get easier, or time will help, and perhaps all of those things are true in their way. But what no one says is that the grief you carry tonight is not the same grief you carried last month, or last year, or the night it first came to you and sat down on your chest and refused to leave. It has moved. It has shifted. It has become something else. Not smaller, not gone, but different. The way a season is different each time it returns. Let us follow that thread for a while. There was a woman who farmed a small piece of land at the edge of a village, in a place where the rains came twice a year, and the rest of the time the earth waited. The land was not generous. It gave what it could: millet, sorghum, a few rows of beans that climbed the dry stalks of the previous season's corn. And in return it asked for everything she had: her hands, her back, her mornings, which began before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, when the sky was the color of embers and the air still held the cool of the night, a cool that would burn off within the hour, but for now lay across the fields like a thin cloth, soft and damp. She was not young. Her knees complained when she knelt to plant, and her lower back held a dull ache that had been there so long it had become part of her, like a sound you stop noticing because it never stops. Her feet were wide and brown and hardened from years of walking the same rows barefoot, the soles thick as leather, the toes gripping the cracked earth, the way roots grip soil, not because they chose to, but because that is what feet do when they have been walking the same ground for 60 years. Her son had died in the early part of the dry season. He was her eldest, the one who would have taken over the land, the one who knew where the water table ran closest to the surface, the one who could read the clouds the way she could read the soil, squinting at the horizon and saying, with the quiet authority of someone who has watched the sky, his whole life, rain in 2 days. He had been right more often than not. And now there was no one to read the clouds. The dry season deepened. The earth cracked. The cracks spread across the field in jagged lines, like the veins on the back of an old hand, and the soil turned pale and powdery, the color of bone. The millet she had planted before his death had not come up. The sorghum stood in dry stalks that rattled when the wind passed through. A sound like old paper being shuffled, a sound that had no music in it. Her neighbor came to see her, an older woman, taller, with a voice that carried across the fields the way a bell carries across a valley, clear and steady and impossible to ignore. "You must keep going," the neighbor said, standing at the edge of the empty field with her arms crossed. "The rains will come. The rains will come when they come," she said. "They do not care whether I am ready. And the planting, what is the point of planting in dry ground?" The neighbor looked at her for a long time. Then she said something that the woman did not expect. "Your feet know the way to this field. Your hands know the soil. Your body has been doing this work since before your mind understood what the work was for. You do not plant because the rain is coming. You plant because your hands do not know how to stop." The woman did not answer. She stood at the edge of the cracked field and looked at the horizon, where the sky met the earth in a wavering line of heat. There was nothing there. No clouds, no promise, just the flat, pale distance and the sound of the wind moving through the dead stalks. But the next morning, she was there again. She did not plant. She simply walked the rows, her bare feet pressing into the dry earth, her body following the path it had followed 10,000 times before. She did not know why she was walking. She did not have a reason. Her feet simply carried her there, the way they had always carried her, because that is what feet do when they have learned a road. She walked the rows every morning for 6 weeks, and then one morning, Not the morning she had hoped for, not the morning she had prayed for, but a morning like any other. A morning when she had stopped watching the sky, because watching had become its own kind of suffering. She felt something on her face. Water, a single drop, then another, then a softness in the air that she recognized the way you recognize a voice you have not heard in a long time. The rain came, not gently. It came the way grief sometimes comes, all at once, heavy, soaking through everything, turning the cracked earth to mud in minutes. The drops so thick and close together that the air itself seemed to turn to water. The first drops hit the dry ground and raised small puffs of dust, and then the dust was gone, washed away, and the ground darkened from bone white to the deep red-brown that she remembered from other seasons, other years. Years when her son had stood beside her in the rain and laughed, because there was nothing else to do when the rain finally came. You could not work, you could not run, you could only stand there and let it find you. She stood in the field and let it fall on her. The water ran down her face and her arms and her legs, warm at first from the heat of her skin, and then cool, then cold, and her dress clung to her body, and her hair lay flat against her head, and the earth beneath her feet softened and gave way, and she sank a little, her toes pressing into the mud, and she did not move. She stood there until the rain eased, until the sky lightened from black to grey to the pale, washed-out blue that comes after a storm has spent itself. And when she finally looked down at the field, the cracks were gone, not healed, filled. The water had found its way into every opening, every fissure, every space where the drought had pulled the earth apart, and it had filled them, not perfectly, not neatly, but completely. The way grief eventually fills the cracks it has made, not with the same material, but with something. The millet would not grow in the same places. The cracks had changed the field. The water found new channels, new low points, new places to gather. And when the green finally came, weeks later, tentative, thin, it came in different rows, in different patterns, in places she had not planted. Grief had done the same thing. It had not left, but it had moved. It had found new channels in her. It had settled into different places, not the sharp, breathless place in her chest where it had lived in the first weeks, but a deeper place, a quieter place, the kind of place where something can take root without anyone noticing. The Buddha once offered a teaching that is often read as a warning, but is in truth a comfort. He said, "All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering." The word he used for impermanence is anicca, and anicca does not mean that things end, though they do. It means that things move. Everything is in motion. The river is not the same river it was an hour ago. The cloud is not the same cloud. The grief you carry is not the same grief it was when it first arrived. Even if it feels the same, even if it wears the same face, even if it visits you at the same hour every night and sits in the same chair and says the same things, it has changed. You have changed. And the fact that you cannot see the change does not mean it has not happened. It means the change is happening slowly, the way seasons change, not in a single moment, but across many mornings, each one slightly different from the last, until one day you step outside, and the air is different, and the light is different, and the birds are singing a song you do not recognize. And you realize that the season has turned without asking your permission. That is anicca. Not cruelty, not indifference, just motion, just the quiet, ceaseless turning of things from one shape into another. There was a woman who kept a garden behind her house. It was not a large garden, just a rectangle of earth bordered by a low stone wall with a wooden gate that creaked when you opened it, and a path of flat stones leading from the back door to the first row of beds. She had been a gardener all her life, but not a serious one. She did not grow vegetables for the market or rare flowers for competitions. She grew what pleased her: lavender and rosemary, and the tall purple alliums that came up every spring like small fireworks frozen in mid-burst, peonies that bloomed for 2 weeks and then collapsed in a heap of petals on the grass. Extravagant and brief, her sister had helped her plant the garden. That was the thing. Every April, without fail, her sister would drive over on a Saturday morning with a flat of seedlings in the back seat and a thermos of coffee balanced on the passenger side, and they would spend the day on their knees in the dirt, their hands moving through the soil the way their mother's hands had moved through soil before them, and their grandmothers before that. A line of women who understood that putting things in the ground and waiting for them to grow was not just gardening, but a kind of faith, a faith that required no church, no scripture, only patience and a willingness to get dirt under your fingernails. Her sister was 3 years older, a little taller, with the same hands, the same broad palms, the same short fingers, the same way of pressing seeds into the soil with her thumb, and then patting the earth over them gently, the way you pull a blanket over a sleeping child. She talked to the plants. She would lean down close to a seedling and say, in a voice that was half serious and half laughing, "All right now, you have everything you need. Sun, water, good soil, the rest is up to you." And the plants, as far as anyone could tell, listened. Her sister had died in the winter, a stroke quick and final, the kind of death that is merciful for the person who dies and merciless for the person who is left holding the phone, listening to the silence on the other end, trying to understand how a conversation that was happening 3 seconds ago is now over permanently, without warning, without a closing sentence. Spring came anyway. That was the cruelty of it, and also the mercy, that the seasons did not wait for her to be ready, that the crocoxus pushed up through the cold earth regardless of what had happened in January, that the birds returned to the garden wall and began to sing as though nothing had changed. She stood at the back door and looked at the garden. The beds were tangled with last year's dead growth, dry stalks, fallen leaves, the brown remains of the peonies she had not cut back in the autumn. She had been at the hospital, and then at the funeral home, and then in the long, shapeless weeks afterward, when the simplest tasks felt like climbing a mountain in heavy shoes. Her neighbor, a quiet man who grew tomatoes against the south wall of his house, leaned over the fence one morning and said, "Will you plant this year?" She looked at the tangled beds. "I do not know. Your sister would want you to." She almost said something sharp. She almost said, "Do not tell me what my sister would want. You did not know her the way I knew her. You did not kneel beside her in this dirt every April, your knees aching, your hands cold, laughing at the same jokes you had been laughing at for 40 years. But she did not say any of that. She simply nodded and went inside. She did plant, but not the same garden. She could not plant the same garden. The peonies had been her sister's idea for more than 2,000 years, and putting them back in the same place would have felt like setting a table for someone who was never coming to dinner. So she moved them. She put them along the far wall, where her sister had always said they would get more afternoon light. And in the beds where the peonies had been, she planted something new. Sweet peas, climbing, fragile, the kind of flower that needs a frame to hold it up, and will, if left alone, tangle itself into a beautiful mess. She did not know why she chose sweet peas. She had never grown them before, but her hands chose them in the garden center, lifting the seed packets from the rack the way her hands had lifted seeds 1,000 times before. By feel, by instinct, by the body's quiet knowledge of what it needs, even when the mind has no idea. The garden grew. It was different. The colors were in the wrong places. The shapes were unfamiliar, and there was a gap, a visible, undeniable gap, where her sister's presence should have been. The place beside her, where a second pair of hands should have been kneeling, a second voice should have been saying, "That one needs more water," or "Move that to the shade, it is burning." But the sweet peas climbed. They reached the top of the frame and then kept going, spilling over the edges, reaching for the wall, reaching for the sky. And one morning in late May, when the sun was warm and the dew was still on the leaves, and the whole garden smelled of earth and green and the particular sweetness of flowers that are opening for the first time, she sat down on the stone path between the beds, and she smiled, not because the grief was gone. It was not gone. It was sitting right beside her the way it always sat beside her, patient and familiar, but because the garden was beautiful. Not the same beautiful, a different beautiful, and she had room for both, the beauty and the grief, the way the garden had room for both the sweet peas and the empty space where the peonies used to be. There was once a poet, a man from a desert tradition, a tradition that understood thirst the way mountain traditions understand cold, who lost someone he loved deeply. His friends came to him, as friends do, and one of them asked, "Do you weep?" The poet said, "Every day." "And does it help?" "It does not help," the poet said, "but between the weeping, I see the sky." His friend did not understand. "That is the point," the poet said gently. "The weeping does not take away the sky, and the sky does not take away the weeping. They exist together. And the heart, the strange, stubborn, impossible heart, has room for both." He paused, and then he added something quieter. "I used to think grief was a door that closed. Now I know it is a window, a very painful window. But the view is everything I would have missed if I had never loved at all." Tonight you may know this already. You may know it in the way grief visits you at unexpected hours, in the middle of a grocery store, while driving, while laughing at something, and then suddenly remembering, the laughter catching in your throat like a fishbone, not painful exactly, just there, sharp and surprising and impossible to swallow. Grief does not make appointments. It does not call ahead. It arrives in the frozen food aisle. When you reach for the brand of cereal they always bought, and your hand stops in mid-air, and you stand there in the bright fluorescent light, surrounded by strangers who are just buying groceries, and you feel the wave come, and you grip the handle of the cart and wait for it to pass. It arrives in the shower, when the hot water is running and the steam is rising, and you are finally alone. And the body decides that this is the moment, this is the safe place. And the crying comes from somewhere so deep that you are not sure it is crying at all. It feels more like the earth moving, like something tectonic shifting beneath the surface. It arrives in the 3 seconds between waking and remembering. Those 3 seconds when the world is still whole, and the bed is still warm, and the person is still alive. And then the remembering comes, quiet and certain, and the world rearranges itself around the absence. And you get up and start the day again, because that is what days ask of you. Not courage, not strength, just the willingness to stand up one more time. Perhaps tonight, lying here, the grief is a little different from last night. Not smaller, not larger, just different. The way the rain on the farmer's field was different from the drought that came before it. Not gentler, not kinder, just a different season of the same weather. And perhaps that difference, that small, barely noticeable shift, is its own kind of movement, its own kind of anicca, its own quiet proof that nothing stays exactly as it is. Not even this. The night has grown quieter now. The stories are settling, the way sediment settles in a glass of water, slowly, without effort, finding their way to the bottom on their own. And there is one more thread to follow tonight. It is the quietest thread, and perhaps the most difficult. It is not about the people we have lost, or the objects they left behind, or the way the seasons carry our sorrow from one shape into another. It is about something closer, something that happens in the dark when no one is listening. It is about the things we say to ourselves, the words we whisper into our own ears, the forgiveness we forgot to give, not to the ones who left, but to ourselves, for the things we did not say, the moments we did not hold, the love we meant to give but ran out of time to give it. Let us go there gently. There is a voice that speaks to us in the dark, not a real voice, not the voice of anyone we could point to or name. It is the voice inside, the one that arrives after everyone else has gone to sleep, the one that replays the conversation for the 100th time, that whispers, "You should have said something different. You should have stayed longer. You should have called. You should have held on. You should have been more patient, more present, more tender, more awake." It is the voice that begins every sentence with "if only" and ends it with a door that closed too soon. And it is, almost always, harder on us than anyone else has ever been. Let us sit with this quietly tonight, because it is the kind of thing that does not respond well to force. There was a woman who, on the anniversary of her husband's death, sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen. She did not know what she was going to write. She only knew that there were words in her that needed somewhere to go, and the people in her life, kind people, patient people, had heard them all before, and she did not want to say them out loud again. So she wrote. She wrote to him. Not a letter, exactly. She was not pretending he would read it. It was more like a conversation with a chair that she knew was empty, but chose to face anyway. The way you face a mirror, not because you want to see yourself, but because you need to look somewhere, and the mirror is there. She wrote, "I am sorry I was not softer with you. I am sorry for the mornings I was in a hurry and the evenings I was too tired and the times I said fine when I meant something else entirely. I am sorry for the argument we had 3 days before you died. The one about the car, or the kitchen, or whatever it was about. Because I cannot even remember now what we were fighting over, only that my voice was sharp and yours was quiet, and I wish I had been the quiet one. She stopped. She looked at what she had written. Then she added one more line. I forgive myself for the times I was not enough. Not because I was enough, but because holding this against myself will not bring you back, and it is making it very hard to breathe. She set the pen down. She folded the paper once, and then once more, and she placed it in the drawer beside the stove, next to the matches and the rubber bands, and the small pair of scissors with the orange handles. She did not seal it. She did not throw it away. She simply set it down, and her shoulders dropped. Just slightly, just a fraction of an inch. The way a door settles into its frame when the house has stopped swaying in the wind. She had not noticed how high they had been. She had been carrying them near her ears for months, braced against something. She did not know what. A blow. A verdict. The sound of someone telling her what she already told herself every night. That she had failed. That she had not loved well enough. That the last words between them had been the wrong words. And that wrong words, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. But no one was going to tell her that. No one but herself. And tonight, sitting at the kitchen table with the pen still warm in her hand, she chose, for the first time, not to. There was a woman, a different woman, though the feeling was the same, who lived alone in a small house, with a green kitchen and a stove that clicked 3 times before the flame caught. She had been a nurse for 31 years. She knew how to hold a dying person's hand. She knew how to speak to someone in pain, softly, clearly, without promising anything she could not deliver. She knew the particular gentleness required to change a bandage without causing the sharp intake of breath that meant you had gone too fast. But she did not know how to be gentle with herself. Her husband had died 8 months ago. Not suddenly. He had been ill for 2 years, and she had cared for him the way she had cared for hundreds of patients before him, with steady hands and a calm voice, and the professional tenderness that she had spent a career perfecting. She had done everything right. She had managed the medications, and adjusted the pillows and kept the room clean, and the sheets fresh and the light soft. She had been by any measure a good caregiver, but she had not been a perfect wife, and it was the imperfection that kept her awake at night. Not the grief. The thing that haunted her was small. It was so small that if she told anyone, they would wave it away. Oh, that is nothing, they would say. Everyone argues. That does not mean anything. But it meant something to her. It meant everything. 3 days before he died, they had argued. About nothing. About the way she had left the kitchen light on, or the way he had asked her to close the window when she had just opened it, or some other small, domestic friction that in a normal life would have dissolved by morning and been forgotten by lunch. But she had been tired, the particular tiredness that comes from caring for someone day and night for 2 years. A tiredness that is not just physical but spiritual. The tiredness of being needed constantly, of never being off duty, of loving someone so much that the love itself becomes a weight you carry in your arms even while you sleep. And so her voice had been sharp, Not cruel, not loud, just sharp, the way a knife is sharp, the edge catching the light for just a moment before you feel it. She had said something. She could not remember the exact words, only the tone, only the way his face had changed. A small tightening around the eyes, a quiet closing, the way a flower closes when the sun goes behind a cloud. He had not said anything back. He had simply turned his head toward the window and looked out at the garden, and she had stood there in the doorway of the bedroom with her hand on the light switch and felt the silence grow between them like cold water rising. She had meant to apologize in the morning, but the morning had been busy. Medications, breakfast, the visiting nurse, and the apology had been pushed to the afternoon. And the afternoon had been pushed to the evening, and 3 days later he was gone. And the apology was still sitting in her chest, undelivered, like a letter with no address. Now she sat in the kitchen at night, the rain tapping softly on the window glass, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold between her hands. The steam rose in a thin line and vanished. The kitchen smelled of chamomile and the faint, clean scent of the dish soap she had used after dinner. And beneath that, something older and quieter. The smell of a house where two people had lived together for 34 years. A smell made of cooking and laundry and skin and breath and the 1,000 invisible exchanges that build up over decades. Like layers of paint on a wall, the chair across from her was empty. It had been empty for 8 months, and every night she sat here, she looked at that chair, and she had the same conversation with it. The conversation she should have had. The apology she should have made. The words she should have found on that Tuesday morning. Instead of reaching for the pill organizer, and the blood pressure cuff, and the efficient professional kindness that was so much easier than the messy, uncertain kindness of simply saying, "I am sorry, I was tired, I love you, forgive me." Tonight though, something shifted. She did not plan it. She did not decide it. It simply happened, the way rain happens, or the way a muscle that has been clenched for too long finally releases. Not because you told it to, but because the body has its own intelligence, its own sense of timing, its own quiet way of knowing when it is time. She looked at the empty chair, and instead of seeing the chair where he used to sit, she saw the chair where she would sit if she had been the one who died first. She saw herself sitting there, tired, grieving, replaying the same argument, carrying the same sharp words, like a stone in her pocket. And she saw him standing in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at her. And she heard what he would say. He would say, "Let it go. It was nothing. I knew what you meant. I always knew what you meant, even when the words came out wrong, especially when the words came out wrong." He would say, "You were tired. You had been carrying me for 2 years, and you snapped." That is what happens when someone carries something heavy for too long. They snap, not because they are weak, but because they are human, and humans have limits, and reaching your limit is not a failure. It is a fact. He would say, "Stop punishing yourself. I never held it against you. Not for a single second. Not even in that moment." She sat very still. The rain continued on the window, each drop tracing a slow line down the glass, and the kitchen was so quiet. She could hear the clock in the hallway, ticking the way it had always ticked, steady and indifferent, marking time that no longer felt like hers. The tea was cold, and she realized that she had been speaking to him, but she had actually been speaking to herself. She had been giving herself the words she needed to hear. She had been forgiving herself in his voice, because her own voice had been too harsh for too long, and she needed a gentler one, and his was the gentlest she had ever known. She set the cup down. She placed both hands flat on the table, palms down, the way you place your hands on something solid. When you need to feel the ground beneath you. The wood was cool and smooth. The rain tapped on the glass, and her shoulders dropped, not all the way. Not like someone who has been freed, but a little. The way they drop when the clenching has eased from unbearable to bearable, which is sometimes all the relief you need. The Buddha once said that hatred is never appeased by hatred. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is an eternal law. He was speaking about the hatred we carry toward others. But the teaching runs deeper than that, because the harshest hatred most of us carry is the hatred we direct inward. The voice that says, "You should have known better. You should have been stronger. You should have loved more perfectly." And that voice is a kind of fire, and it burns from the inside, and no amount of self-punishment will put it out. Only the opposite of punishment can do that. Only softness, only the willingness to look at yourself the way you would look at someone you love very much. With patience, with tenderness, with the understanding that being imperfect is not a flaw, but a condition, the condition of being alive. The ancient word for this is metta. It is usually translated as loving kindness, and it is usually directed outward, toward friends, toward strangers, toward the difficult people in our lives, toward the world. But metta begins at home. It begins with the person lying in the dark, holding her own grief, whispering her own name. It begins with the radical, uncomfortable, deeply necessary act of treating yourself with the same gentleness you would offer to anyone else who came to you carrying what you are carrying. There was an old teacher who lived in a monastery on a mountainside, where the winters were long and the silence was so deep you could hear the snow settling on the roof the way dust settles on a windowsill. Softly, patiently, without weight. The monastery was simple. Stone walls, a wooden floor worn smooth by generations of bare feet, a single window made of oiled paper that let in a pale, milky light during the day, and at night became a square of darkness framed in pine. The teacher had been a monk for over 40 years. He had sat on this floor in this room through more winters than he could count. The cold did not bother him the way it once had. It had become familiar, a companion, almost. The way silence becomes a companion when you have lived with it long enough. In the winter, the stone walls held the cold the way a bowl holds water, and the air inside the room was always a few degrees cooler than the air outside, and his breath made small clouds that hung in front of his face for a moment before dissolving. He had taught many students, young men and women, who came to the mountain, carrying their questions the way travelers carry bundles, holding them tightly, afraid to set them down. On this night, the moon was full. Its light came through the paper window and lay on the floor in a soft rectangle, pale and steady, and the teacher sat in that light with his legs folded beneath him and his hands resting on his knees. The incense had burned down to ash hours ago, but the ghost of its scent still lingered. Sandalwood, and something sweeter beneath it, something that clung to the old wood, and the stone and the robes that hung from the hook by the door. A student sat across from him, a young woman, earnest, careful, the kind of student who wrote down everything and understood half of it, which was, teacher thought it, the correct ratio for someone at the beginning of the path. Teacher, she said, have you let go of everything? He did not answer immediately. He looked at the moonlight on the floor. He listened to the silence, which was not empty but full, full of the wind outside, full of the creak of old wood adjusting to the cold, full of two people breathing in a small room on a dark mountain. I have let go of many things, he said finally, but not everything. There is one thing I carry. He paused, not because I have failed to let it go, but because it has become part of me, the way a river becomes part of the land it runs through. You cannot separate the river from the banks it has carved. What is it? My mother, he said simply. She died when I was 7 years old. I remember very little. Her hands, the sound of her voice when she sang, the way she smelled of wood smoke and rain. I was told to let go of these things. I was told that attachment to the dead is a chain that binds us to suffering, and perhaps that is true. But I found, over the years, that letting go of her was not the same as letting go of what she taught me. What did she teach you? The teacher smiled, not broadly, not with joy exactly, but with the kind of softness that comes from having looked at something painful for a very long time, and finding that it has, without your noticing, become something beautiful. She taught me to be gentle, he said, not by telling me to be gentle, by being gentle herself, the way she held things, the way she spoke to animals, the way she put me to bed at night, not quickly, not efficiently, but slowly, as though putting a child to bed were the most important work in the world. He looked at his student. I did not let go of that. I carried it with me into this robe, into this room, into every conversation I have ever had with every student who has ever sat where you are sitting. And if that is attachment, then it is the kind of attachment I am willing to carry, because it does not weigh me down. It makes me lighter. The student was quiet for a long time. Then she said, so grief can become something else. Grief always becomes something else, the teacher said. The question is whether we let it choose its own shape, or whether we try to force it into a shape we think it should be. The forcing is the suffering. The letting it be, that is the beginning of metta. The moonlight had moved across the floor. It now touched the edge of the teacher's robe, and the fabric glowed faintly, white against the dark wood, and the two of them sat in the quiet, breathing together, neither one speaking, because some things are better held in silence than in words. Tonight, if there is something you have been saying to yourself in the dark, an accusation, a regret, a sentence that begins with, I should have. Perhaps you can set it down, just for this moment, not because it is not true. Perhaps it is true. Perhaps you should have called. Perhaps you should have stayed. Perhaps you should have said the thing that was sitting in your throat for years, the thing you kept meaning to say, and kept putting off, because there would always be tomorrow until there was not. But holding that against yourself tonight will not change what happened. And the person you lost, if they could speak to you right now, if they could sit beside you in this bed, in this dark, they would not say the things you are saying to yourself. They would say something softer, something closer to, You did what you could. And what you could was more than you think. Perhaps tonight you can speak to yourself the way you would speak to someone you love very much who came to you carrying this same weight. Gently, without conditions, without the need for them to earn your kindness first. Perhaps you can place your hand on your own chest, the way the weaver did many stories ago, and feel the beating there, and say nothing at all, and let the beating be its own kind of forgiveness. The night has deepened. The moon, wherever it is, has moved across the sky without asking anyone's permission. And there is one more thing to share with you tonight. Something that grief, for all its weight, cannot take away. Something so quiet you may not have noticed it is still there. But it is, and it has been there all along. There is something that grief cannot take from you. It can take the voice you used to hear in the next room. It can take the weight on the other side of the bed. It can take the future you had planned, the trips, the anniversaries, the ordinary Tuesday evenings you thought you would always have. But there is something it cannot reach, something so quiet you may not have noticed it is still there. The way you do not notice your own heartbeat until you place your hand on your chest and feel it, steady, faithful, unhurried, doing its work without being asked. Let us look for it together. There was a woman who made bread. She had been making bread for 31 years in a bakery that sat on the corner of a street lined with horse chestnut trees that dropped their fruit every autumn in hard green shells that split open on the pavement and rolled into the gutter. The bakery was small, just a single room with a counter at the front and an oven at the back, the kind of oven that held heat, the way a stone wall holds heat, slowly releasing it through the afternoon, so that even at closing time the room was warm and the air smelled of flour and yeast and the particular golden sweetness of bread that has been baked properly, not rushed, not forgotten, but watched and turned and taken out. At the moment when the crust is just beginning to deepen from pale gold to the color of autumn leaves, her hands were her instruments. They were not delicate hands. They were wide and strong, the knuckles thick, the skin rough from years of kneading, the nails kept short because dough gets under long nails and stays there. She could tell by touch whether the dough had been kneaded enough, not by counting minutes or following a recipe, but by the feel of it beneath her palms, the way it changed from sticky and resistant to smooth and yielding. The moment when the gluten strands aligned and the dough became alive under her hands, warm and elastic, breathing almost, rising and falling as she pressed and folded. The flour dust hung in the air every morning like a fine mist, catching the early light that came through the front window and turning it silver. The window faced east, and in the first hour after dawn, when she was already 2 hours into her work, the light came in at a low angle and illuminated the dust, so that the whole room seemed to glow from within, as though the air itself were made of something precious. The oven ticked as it heated, a quiet rhythmic sound, metal expanding against metal, and beneath it the deeper hum of the gas flame, steady and low, a sound she had stopped hearing years ago, the way you stop hearing rain when you have lived beside a river long enough. Her husband had died 14 months ago. He had been the one who opened the shop each morning at 4, who turned on the ovens and measured the flour and set the first batch of dough to rise while she was still sleeping. He had not been a baker by training. He had been an engineer, a man who understood systems and measurements and the precise relationships between things. But he had learned to bake the way he had learned everything else. Methodically, thoroughly, with the quiet patience of someone who believed that any skill worth having was worth learning slowly. And now she opened the shop alone. She arrived at 4, in the dark, and she turned on the ovens herself, and she measured the flour herself, and the silence in the kitchen was so complete that she could hear the yeast activating in the warm water, a faint, almost imperceptible fizzing, the sound of something coming alive. She worked through the silence, the way she worked through the dough, steadily, without stopping, her hands doing what they had always done, her body moving through the kitchen by memory, reaching for the salt, without looking, pulling the baking sheets from the rack, without counting, sliding the loaves into the oven with the same smooth motion she had used 10,000 times before. She did not know who she was baking for. That was the thing that kept her awake at night. Not the grief itself, which had settled into something she could carry, but the question beneath the grief, the question that had no answer. Why am I still doing this? He was the reason the bakery existed. He was the one who had said, 31 years ago, standing in this very room, when it was still an empty storefront with peeling paint and a broken window, I think this could be something. And she had looked at the room and seen nothing, and he had looked at the room and seen bread, and warmth, and the smell of something good coming out of an oven on a cold morning, and he had been right. He had always been right about the things that mattered, but now he was gone, and the bread was still rising, and she did not know what to do with a question that had no one left to answer it. One morning, a morning in late November, when the dark outside the window was so thick it felt like a wall, her first customer arrived, an old woman, thin, wrapped in a grey wool coat that was too large for her, the sleeves falling past her wrists. She came every morning at 6:15, without fail, and she always ordered the same thing, a small round loaf, the plain one, no seeds, no herbs, just flour and water and salt and thyme. She never said much. She paid in coins that she counted out slowly from a small leather purse, and she carried the bread home in a cloth bag. And that was the whole of their interaction, brief, wordless, habitual, the kind of exchange that is so ordinary it becomes invisible. But on this morning, the old woman paused at the counter. She held the loaf in both hands, close to her face, and she breathed in. And then she looked up at the baker and said, in a voice that was quiet but clear, "Your bread is different now." The baker felt something tighten in her chest. She had feared this, that the bread had changed, that without him the recipe had shifted, that something essential had been lost in the translation from 2 pairs of hands to 1. Different how? She asked, and she braced herself for the answer. The old woman looked at the loaf for a long moment. Then she said, "It tastes like someone who has been through something. It has a heaviness to it that was not there before. Not unpleasant, just present. The way a song sounds different when you know the singer has been weeping." The baker did not know what to say. "It is still good bread," the old woman said. "Perhaps better. I do not know, but it is different. And I wanted you to know that I taste it. Whatever it is you are carrying, it is in the bread." and I eat it every morning, and it has not made me turn away." She placed her coins on the counter and left, the bell above the door chiming once. As she passed through, and the baker stood alone in the warm kitchen with the flour dust drifting in the early light, and her hands were still dusted with flour, and the oven was still ticking. And she realized that the question she had been asking, "Who am I baking for?" had been answered, not with words, but with the quiet fact of an old woman who came every morning at 6:15 and ate bread that tasted of grief and did not turn away. She rested her hands on the counter. The wood was smooth and warm from the heat of the oven, and she stood there for a long time, not moving, not thinking, just resting, the way a body rests when it has finally set down something it did not know it was carrying. There is a stone in a river. It has been there longer than anyone can remember. Longer than the bridge that crosses the river. Longer than the village on the bank. Longer than the oldest tree whose roots reach down into the water and hold the bank together the way fingers hold the edge of a table. The stone sits in the center of the current, and the water moves around it, over it, under it, endlessly, day and night, winter and summer, in flood and in drought. The water has not moved the stone. It has tried, gently, persistently, the way only water tries, without force, without frustration. In all these years, in all these seasons, the current has not pushed it downstream, has not rolled it to the bank, has not buried it in silt. The stone is still there, in the same place, holding its ground the way stones do, not by effort, not by will, but by weight, by the simple fact of being heavy enough to stay. But the water has changed the stone, not quickly, not dramatically, slowly, the way all real change happens, so slowly that you cannot see it happening, only the result. The sharp edges are gone. The rough surfaces have been smoothed. The stone that was once angular and jagged is now round and soft, the kind of stone a child picks up from the riverbed and holds in her palm because it feels good there, because it fits, because something about its smoothness speaks to something in the hand that wants to hold it. The water did not take anything from the stone. It did not make it smaller. It did not wear it down to nothing. It simply softened what was hard. It rounded what was sharp. It made the stone easier to hold. Grief does this. Not the first grief. The first grief is the flood. The water rising fast and cold, covering everything. But the grief that comes after, the grief that stays, the quiet current that moves through you day after day, month after month, that grief is the water on the stone. It does not take you away. It does not make you less. It softens you. It rounds the edges that you did not know were sharp. And one day, not today, perhaps, but one day, you reach down and find that the thing you are carrying is not the jagged, cutting weight it was in the beginning. It is something smoother, something you can rest in your hand without bleeding. That is not healing. That word is too neat, too final, too much like a door that closes and locks behind you. It is something else. It is what remains after the water has done its work. There was a woman who kept the garden of an old temple on a hillside above a town where the rooftops were made of dark tile and the streets were narrow, and the sound of temple bells drifted down the hill every evening. At dusk, carried by the wind the way seeds are carried, lightly, without direction, landing wherever the wind decided to set them down. The garden was not large, but it was old. The stones along the path had been placed there by hands that had been dust for centuries, and the moss that grew between them was so thick and soft that walking on it felt like walking on something alive, something that yielded under your feet and then slowly, patiently, rose back to its original shape after you had passed. A small stream ran along the eastern edge of the garden, fed by a spring somewhere higher on the hill, and the water moved over a bed of smooth pebbles with a sound like someone whispering. Not words, just the shape of words, the breath and rhythm of speech without the meaning. The woman had tended this garden for 40 years. She had come to the temple as a young woman after her husband died in a fishing accident. His boat caught in a storm, the sea doing what the sea does, without malice or intention, simply moving the way it moves, and anyone caught in that movement is carried wherever the water goes. She had been 29, her son had been 3, and she had brought the boy to the temple because she had nowhere else to go. And the old abbot had looked at her and at the child and had said, simply, "The garden needs tending." That was 40 years ago. The boy had grown and gone. He lived in the city now, a good man, a quiet man, the kind of man who called every Sunday and visited twice a year and brought his children, who ran through the garden paths with the reckless joy of people who have not yet learned that gardens are places of grief as much as beauty. Her son had his own life, his own family, his own sorrow that he carried in his own way, and she did not ask him to carry hers. The garden was where her grief lived, not in the stones or the moss or the water, but in the work, in the daily act of kneeling on the cold ground and pulling weeds and trimming branches and raking the gravel into patterns that the rain would erase, and she would rake again the next morning. The repetition was the point. The fact that the work was never finished was the point. The garden did not ask her to complete anything. It only asked her to continue. One spring afternoon, a young nun who had recently arrived at the temple came to the garden and sat on the stone bench beside the stream. She watched the old woman work for a long time, the slow, careful movements, the way her hands moved through the soil, the way a swimmer's hands move through water, parting it gently, disturbing as little as possible. "Who do you tend the garden for?" the young nun asked. The old woman did not stop working. She reached for a weed at the base of the wisteria vine, the vine that her husband had planted the year they arrived, a single cutting he had carried from their old house wrapped in a damp cloth. The vine had grown for 40 years. It now covered the entire gate, and in spring, its flowers hung down in long purple clusters that swayed in the wind and filled the entrance with a scent so sweet it made visitors pause on the threshold and close their eyes. "My husband planted this vine," the old woman said, pulling the weed free and setting it in her basket. "He did not live to see it bloom. He planted it in autumn, and by the next spring he was gone." She rested her hands on her knees and looked up at the canopy of purple flowers above the gate. "He is not here, but the shade is still here. The scent is still here. The bees still come every spring and rest in the flowers and carry the sweetness to places I will never see." The young nun was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So you tend the garden for his memory?" "No," the old woman said. "I tend the garden because my hands know how to tend, and because someone will need this shade after I am gone. That is what remains, child. Not the person, not the grief, the shade. The sweetness that the bees carry, the path that someone else will walk on a morning when they need a quiet place to rest. An ancient verse from the Metta Sutta says, "Just as a mother would protect her only child with her life, even so, let one cultivate a boundless love towards all beings." The old woman in the garden had done this, not by grand gesture, not by teaching, not by speaking wisdom. She had done it with her hands in the dirt, one weed at a time. She had taken the grief that could have closed her heart and turned it outward, into shade, into beauty, into a garden where strangers could come and sit beside a stream and rest, and not know that every flower they were looking at had been planted by a woman who was learning, slowly, over 40 years, to let her sorrow become something that others could rest beneath. The ancient word for this is dana. It is usually translated as generosity, and it is usually understood as giving money, food, time, the things we can measure. But dana runs deeper than that. It is the willingness to take what you have. Even if what you have is grief, even if what you have is a pair of tired hands and a heart that aches, and offer it. Not because it will fix anything, not because it will bring anyone back, but because offering is what the hands want to do when they have finally stopped gripping. It is what the heart wants to do when it has finally stopped protecting itself from the world. It is the natural movement of a life that has been softened by the water and rounded by the current, and is ready, at last, to rest in someone else's open palm. Tonight, if you are lying here with hands that have carried more than anyone knows, if you have spent your days holding things together, holding things up, holding things in, perhaps you can let your hands rest. Not because the carrying is over. It may never be over, but because your hands deserve to be still. Because the bread you baked today, the garden you tended, the work you did with your tired and faithful body, that is what remains. That is the shade. That is the sweetness the bees carry. Wet your hands now. Feel where they are. On the blanket, on the pillow, on your own chest. Feel what they have held today. And let them be still. Let them rest the way the stone rests in the river. Not by effort, not by will, but by the quiet, patient weight of simply being here. The night has deepened, and we have come a long way together, you and I, through villages and workshops and gardens and kitchens, through the weight of what is missing, through the kindness of those who stayed, through the things that break and the things they left behind, through seasons of sorrow and the forgiveness we forgot to give ourselves. And now the stories are settling, the way leaves settle on still water, slowly, without effort, finding their own place on the surface and resting there. Let us rest here together for a little while. At the very beginning of tonight, we sat with a word, soka, the ancient word for grief. And we said that grief is not a problem to be solved. It is not an illness to be cured. It is not a sign that something has gone wrong with you. It is the natural response of a heart that has loved deeply and lost what it loved. And there is nothing broken about that. There is nothing broken about you. You are not grieving because you are weak. You are grieving because you loved, and the love came first, before the grief, and it will be there after the grief has done its work, quieter, perhaps, and shaped differently, but there, still there, the way the roots of a tree are still there, long after the leaves have fallen. There was a woman who mended things. She had been mending things all her life. Buttons and hems, and the small tears that appear in the elbows of shirts and the knees of trousers, and the places where fabric wears thin from being touched too often, from being reached for too many times, from being loved in the way that only every day things are loved, not with reverence but with use, with the casual, unconscious tenderness of hands that pick up the same coat every morning without thinking about it. Her workroom was small. A single lamp sat on the table beside the sewing basket, casting a circle of warm light that reached just far enough to illuminate the fabric in her lap, and the needle between her fingers and the spool of thread that stood upright on the table like a small, patient sentinel. Beyond the circle of light, the room fell into shadow. The bookshelf against the far wall, the armchair by the window where no one sat anymore, the coat hook on the back of the door where a single coat still hung, though the person who had worn it would not be coming back to claim it. The air in the room smelled of old fabric, that particular scent, not unpleasant, slightly dusty, the smell of fibers that have absorbed years of weather and skin and soap, and the faint trace of cologne that had faded to almost nothing, but was still there if you pressed your face into the collar and breathed in slowly, the way she had done once, 2 months after he died, standing alone in the hallway at 3 in the morning, holding his coat against her face and breathing in, and finding him there, faint and fading, but there. Tonight she was mending that coat, not because it needed mending. It would never be worn again. Not because she was keeping it. She had not decided yet whether to keep it or give it away. And she had stopped trying to decide, because the deciding was a kind of suffering she did not need to add to the suffering she already carried. She was mending it because her hands needed something to do, because the evening was long, and the house was quiet, and the silence had a weight to it that pressed against her chest, and the only way she knew to ease that weight was to pick up the needle and the thread and do the one thing her hands had always known how to do. She had found the coat in the closet that afternoon, pushed to the back behind the winter blankets, half hidden as though it had been trying to make itself small, trying not to be noticed, trying not to cause the sharp catch in her chest that it caused every time she saw it. She had not touched it in months, but today her hand had found it, reaching for a blanket, her fingers brushing the sleeve, and the sleeve was cool and smooth and familiar, and before she knew what she was doing, she had pulled it out and carried it to the table and spread it open under the lamp, the way a doctor spreads a patient's chart carefully, with attention, looking for the place where the damage is. The tear was in the lining, near the inside pocket, a small rip where the stitching had come loose, the kind of tear that happens slowly, over years, from the repeated motion of reaching in and pulling out keys, a wallet, a folded piece of paper, the small necessities that a person carries every day without thinking about them. She threaded the needle, dark thread, almost black, to match the lining, and she began to stitch. The needle moved through the fabric with a soft, rhythmic sound. A sound so quiet, it was almost not a sound at all. More like the idea of a sound, the ghost of a sound, the whisper of metal passing through cloth. She stitched slowly, deliberately, each stitch even and small and careful, the way her mother had taught her to stitch when she was a girl of 8. Sitting at a table much like this one, in a circle of light much like this one, learning that the quality of a mend is not in the thread or the needle, but in the patience of the hands that hold them. She did not think about him while she stitched. That was the strange thing. When she was mending, her mind went quiet, not empty, not blank, but quiet, the way a room goes quiet when everyone has stopped talking and is simply sitting together, breathing, present, content to be in each other's company without filling the air with words. The needle moved, the thread followed, the tear closed, stitch by stitch, and the closing was its own kind of meditation, its own kind of prayer. Not a prayer for anything, not a prayer to anyone, just the steady, rhythmic act of making something whole that had come apart. When she finished, she held the coat up in the lamplight and looked at the mend. You could barely see it. The stitches were small and tight and even, and the lining lay flat, and the tear was closed, and the coat looked the way it had always looked, ordinary, familiar, unchanged. But she knew the mend was there. She could feel it with her fingertips. A faint ridge of thread beneath the surface, invisible but present, the way grief is invisible but present, the way love is invisible but present, the way everything that matters most in this life runs just beneath the surface, where no one can see it but the person who put it there. She folded the coat carefully, once lengthwise, then once across, the way he had always folded it, the way she had watched him fold it 1,000 times, standing in the hallway after work, hanging his keys on the hook, folding his coat over his arm with that particular neatness that was not fussiness but care, the care of a man who believed that small things deserved attention. She carried it to the closet and placed it on the shelf beside the blankets, and she let her hand rest on it for a moment, just a moment, just the time it takes to draw one slow breath, and the fabric was warm from her lap and smooth from her hands, and the mend was hidden beneath the surface, where only she would ever know it was there. And she closed the door quietly, the way you close a door when someone is sleeping in the next room. And then she went back to the table and sat down and placed her hands flat on the wood, palms down, the way the nurse had placed her hands on the kitchen table many stories ago. And she felt the surface beneath her, cool, smooth, solid. And she sat there for a long time in the quiet, in the warm circle of light, her hands resting, her breath slow, her shoulders down, and she did not cry, and she did not smile, and she did not do anything at all except sit there, being alive, being present, being a woman who had mended something that did not need mending because her hands needed the work, and the work was its own kind of healing. She had not mended the coat. She understood that now. She had been mending the space between what was and what is. The space where he used to be, the small, quiet, invisible tear in the fabric of her days, the tear that no one else could see, the tear that opened every evening, when the light faded and the house grew still, and the world narrowed to this room, this lamp, this circle of light. She had stitched it closed, not permanently, not forever, but for tonight, and tonight was enough. What you gave to the people you have lost was not wasted. The meals you cooked that no one thanked you for, the nights you sat up waiting, the years you spent tending and carrying and showing up, day after day, in the ordinary, unremarkable way that love shows up. not with grand gestures, but with presence, with the steady, patient act of being there. None of that was wasted. It went somewhere. It became something. It became the shade that someone else is resting under right now. Even if you cannot see them, even if you will never know their name. And what you carry tonight, the grief, the regret, the longing, the quiet ache that has no name, that is not a burden you were meant to carry alone. You have been carrying it because you did not know where to set it down. But perhaps tonight, listening to these stories, something has softened just enough. Not all the way, not completely, but enough. And you can feel the place where the weight has shifted, where the sharp edge has been rounded by the water, where the hands that have been gripping have begun, just barely to open. There is an old parable about a candle, a single candle burning in a dark room. The flame is small, no larger than a fingertip, and the wax beneath it has been slowly, steadily consumed the way all fuel is consumed by the fire it feeds. The candle has been burning for a long time. It has lit this room through many evenings. It has held the dark at bay with nothing more than this, a small flame, a quiet light, a warmth that reaches only a few inches in any direction, but is, within those few inches, absolute. And now the wax is nearly gone. The flame is lower than it was, closer to the base, flickering slightly in a draft that comes from somewhere, a crack in the window, a gap beneath the door, the small, invisible openings that every room has, the places where the outside air finds its way in no matter how carefully you have sealed the walls. The candle does not know it is dying. It simply continues to burn, the way it has always burned, giving its light, without calculation, without reserve, without holding anything back, for later. And just before the last of the wax is gone, just before the flame reaches the bottom and flickers and goes out, it touches the wick of another candle, a new candle, standing beside it, close enough to catch the heat, and the new wick catches, and a new flame rises, and the light continues. That is what love does. It does not ask to last forever. It does not bargain with the dark. It does not demand guarantees or receipts or proof that the burning was worth it. It simply burns for as long as it can, as brightly as it can, giving its warmth to whoever is near enough to feel it. A child sitting on the floor, reading by its light. A woman mending a coat in its glow. A man sitting on a porch watching the evening settle over the yard. The candle does not choose who receives its warmth. It simply gives. And in the last moment, the moment when everything else has been used up, it passes itself on. Not the same flame, a different flame, but the same light, the same warmth, the same quiet refusal to let the dark have the final word. The person you lost was that candle. They burned for you. They lit your room. And before they went, they passed something on, not intentionally, perhaps, not in words, not in a letter, not in a will or a document or a speech. They passed it on the way candles do, by proximity, by warmth, by the simple fact of having been close enough to you for long enough that something of their flame caught in you and is burning still. Tonight, you are both candles. You are the one that has been burning steadily, faithfully, through a long night. And you are the one that has just been lit, the new flame, trembling slightly, finding its shape, learning how to hold its own light in a room that is larger and darker than it expected. You are both. You have always been both. And now, The stories are settling. You can feel them finding their places. The weaver, who sat in the dark and placed her hand on her chest and felt her own heartbeat. The potter's wife, who set a cup of tea on the workbench every morning for 3 months without being seen. The snail shell in the garden, empty and light, holding the shape of a life that has passed. The rain falling on the cracked field, filling every fissure, not healing the earth, but changing it. The old woman in the temple garden, tending the wisteria her husband planted, making shade for people she would never meet. They are all here. They have been here all along, waiting for you to lie down and let them find you. Let them rest now. Let the stories be still. They do not need you to hold them. They will hold themselves the way all good stories do. Quietly in the background, waiting for the night when you need them again. Your body knows what to do now. It has been listening, even when your mind was wandering, even when you drifted in and out of the stories, the way you drift in and out of sleep. On a night when the wind is gentle and the room is warm, your body has been doing its own quiet work, softening the muscles around your eyes, releasing the small clenching in your jaw, letting the shoulders drop away from the ears, where they have been held all day, braced against something that never came. Let them drop now. Let the weight of your head rest fully on the pillow, not held up, not half alert, but resting, the way the stone rests in the river, the way the shell rests in the grass, the way the coat rests on the shelf after it has been mended and folded and set down. Your hands are somewhere in the dark. Perhaps they are resting on the blanket. Perhaps they have found each other and are lying together, loosely, the way hands lie when they have stopped working and are simply being hands. Warm, quiet, open. Let them be still. They have done their work for today. They have carried and held and reached and touched, and now they can rest. Whatever they were holding, they can set it down. Not forever, just for tonight, just for now. Feel how heavy your body has become. Not the heaviness of grief. You know that heaviness. You have carried it for long enough to know its weight. This is a different heaviness. This is the heaviness of a body that is ready to rest. A body that has been given permission to stop holding itself up. A body that is sinking into the mattress the way the stone sinks into the riverbed. Slowly, gently, finding the place where it fits. Your breath has slowed. You may not have noticed, but it has. The breath that was shallow when you first lay down. The breath that was up in your chest, tight and quick, has found its way deeper, down into the belly, down into the soft, warm center of you where the breath lives when it is not being rushed or worried or held. Let it be there. Let it be slow. Let it rise and fall the way the tide rises and falls. Not because anyone tells it to, but because that is what breath does when it is left alone. It finds its own rhythm. It always does. And each breath is a small act of faith, the quiet, unconscious belief that there will be another breath after this one, and another after that, and that the breathing will go on, steady and patient, carrying you through the night, the way it has carried you through every night before this one. The night is quiet now. Wherever you are, in whatever room, in whatever bed, in whatever corner of the world you have made your own, the night is doing what it does. It is holding you, not tightly, not the way grief holds you, with its weight and its heat and its refusal to let go. Gently, the way the dark holds the stars. Not to keep them, not to own them, but to give them somewhere to shine. You do not need to finish grieving tonight. Grief does not finish. It changes. We have learned that together, you and I, over the course of these long, quiet hours, it changes the way seasons change, the way rivers change their course, the way a garden looks different each spring even though the soil is the same. Your grief will be there in the morning, patient as always, sitting in its familiar chair, waiting for you the way it always waits, not to punish you, not to remind you of what you have lost, but because it is part of you now, the way the mend is part of the coat, invisible but there, holding the fabric together in the place where it came apart. But tonight, this one night, this particular night, this night that will never come again, you can rest. Tonight, the carrying can stop. Tonight, your hands can be still, and your breath can be slow, and your body can be heavy on this bed. And you can close your eyes and let the story settle around you, like snow on a quiet field. Softly, without weight, without sound, covering everything in white. The moon is out there somewhere, above the clouds, above the rooftops, above the trees that stand in the dark, like patient sentinels, watching over the houses where people sleep. You do not need to see it. You only need to know that it is there, the way you know that the people you have loved are there. Not in the room, not beside you, not where you can touch them, but there, in the light that reaches you from a place you cannot see, steady and pale and quiet and faithful. Good night. Sleep gently. You have carried enough for one day. If these stories have given you any comfort tonight, any small measure of quiet, any moment where the weight lifted, even briefly, you are welcome here, anytime. You can subscribe to this channel so that the next time sleep is hard to find, another story will be waiting for you. And if you know someone who is grieving tonight, someone who is lying awake in their own dark room, carrying their own weight, perhaps you can share this with them. Not as advice, not as a fix, just as company. Just as a voice in the dark that says, you are not alone, you were never alone, and the love you gave is still out there, quiet and steady, doing its work in the world. Rest well. Good night.